Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the House passed the Pandemic is Over Act, terminating the national COVID-19 state of emergency. Now, of course, the pandemic is over. It has been over for some time. Americans are well aware of this. It seems only the government has not been aware of it at the national level and in certain states in this country. So we passed this bill, the House of Representatives did, ending the state of emergency, ending the national emergency, and the president responded in a very interesting way. He agreed with us. He said, yes, the emergency is over on May 11th, which is a very interesting concept, emergency that you can schedule to end in advance. This is a page out of Gavin Newsom's book in California, where the state of emergency there had continued month after month, year after year. And as the absurdities piled up, as California last year hosted the Super Bowl during a state of emergency, and as, by the way, the governor refused to abide personally by the dictates issued pursuant to that emergency, eventually he was forced to say, okay, I will end it, but he decided to end it 6 months in advance. And so the state of emergency in California will now be elapsing on February 28th for those keeping score at home, and the national emergency will be elapsing on May 11th. This is inherently against the very concept of an emergency, to say that we can schedule it to end at a specific date in the future. And it's also against the very concept of an emergency to say that it can last for 3 years. We have in this country, for now almost 3 years, experienced our form of government being turned on its head. As at the national level, and in particular in certain states, our entire separation of powers, checks and balances, and representative government collapsed under a one-man rule. And now that we have moved on from most of that, although there are still some remnants of the controls that were put in place still in effect, we're in a position to assess what was the outcome of all of this. Because yes, there was some uniformity in terms of federal policy, but there was a great degree of difference in terms of how different states responded. Now, in my state of California, we had the highest level of government coercion and control throughout the entire COVID-19 experience. We had the most onerous business shutdowns, the longest school shutdowns, the worst church shutdowns. We had the most onerous mask mandates and vaccine passports. Each and every step of the way, California had the highest level of government coercion and control, generally done via executive orders, without the say of the people, without the say of the legislature, without meaningful judicial review, with 40 million people of our state expected to simply comply. That was the California experience. That was the experience, to a lesser extent, of many other states. But then you had states like Florida that decided that citizens could be trusted to make decisions for themselves, that empowered local communities to govern themselves, that focused on disease control rather than population control. And so we can now look, having now been through this for a few years and have had very different approaches, what was the result of this difference in policy? Well, economically speaking, California had basically the highest unemployment rate in the entire country throughout the COVID-19 state of emergency, whereas Florida had just about the lowest unemployment rate in the country throughout the state of emergency. California has experienced student learning loss unlike anything that has ever been seen before in this country. There's been a 6% decline in third graders reading at grade level over the last few years, a 7% decline for fourth graders in meeting ELA standards, whereas Florida achieved the highest national assessment of educational progress rankings in their history across math and reading for fourth and eighth graders in 2022. In California, to take another example, in LA, our students lost an equivalent of 6 months of math in terms of their overall education in that period of time, and we are going to be grappling with the consequences of this for a long, long time. So California experienced an economic and educational calamity that states like Florida did not experience. And what did we get in return? Because we were all told this was done for the purpose of safety. It was done in order to save lives. Well, we can now assess that claim, and when you look at the actual numbers, there was no difference. Age-adjusted COVID mortality rates between California and Florida were a wash. It was the same, despite the unbelievable toll that the lockdowns and related policies took on the people of California. You can also make comparisons within our state. I represent a number of counties that did everything possible to take the approach that Florida did, despite what we were dealing with at the state level. So in Placer County, for example, we were the first county in the state to end the local state of emergency. We had our kids back in school earlier than anywhere else in California. We were among the first to end mask mandates and to challenge vaccine mandates. And we did everything possible to enable our businesses to remain open. All the while, we took the steps that were necessary to give vulnerable individuals the tools that they needed to protect themselves. Now, all the while, those of us who favored trusting citizens, who favored freedom, were attacked viciously by the likes of the governor of California, who personally attacked me by name and said that I believed it would have been better to let Californians die. Well, again, you can look at the results in Placer County as compared to other parts of California. Our students did much better. Our employment rate was roughly half the state average, and our public health outcomes were much better, with a COVID mortality rate about 2/3 that of the rest of the state. So the evidence now is very clear as to what approach worked and what approach didn't. That those states that tried in as much as possible to maintain the structure of our constitutional form of government did a lot better than those states that decided an emergency could be used to effectuate an indeterminate one-man rule. But there are some who are now saying, as a recent headline in the Atlantic magazine put it, that we should simply declare a pandemic amnesty at this point, that we should move on, we should forget about all of the damage that was done to our kids who may never get the education learning loss, may never make up for the learning loss that they experienced. We should forget the damages that was done to businesses that in many cases have been permanently lost, tens of thousands, 200,000 businesses throughout the country that were shuttered. We should simply move on and forget about it and forgive and forget. And look, I'm all for letting bygones be bygones. And I am willing to work with anyone who is interested in creating good policy going forward. But we do need to pause and consider how it is that this happened in our country. How did we get to a point where the appearance of a virus could cause our entire form of government to collapse? Our founders were not unfamiliar with emergencies. After all, they had just been through a war of independence, and yet they still believed that combining the executive, legislative, and judicial powers in a single set of hands, as James Madison put it, was the very definition of tyranny. So how, well over 2 centuries now after the founding, did we get to a point where our institutions were so susceptible to collapse? And I think that is a question that merits serious scrutiny, because it could point us in the direction of getting back to some of the founding principles that we've lost touch with. The fact is that we have seen governmental power become more and more centralized and consolidated in recent decades in this country. And it became simply all too easy to fast forward that process to its logical endpoint of one-man rule. We have seen our political institutions become less and less representative, less and less self-governing institutions, and it became all too easy to make them not representative at all. Or we've seen more and more of our levers of power in government controlled by special interest groups, especially in California, my state, and so it became all too easy to let special interests completely run the show, as they did when it came to the school shutdowns. So I don't believe that we can simply move on and turn the page and forget about what happened in this country for the last few years. I think we need to give serious thought as to what led us to this point, because that and how we can move ahead and actually now get the pendulum swinging in the other direction. And that's a far more in-depth conversation than my time today will permit. But I would simply like to offer a few ideas. And the first is that we need to definitively end the emergency, not on May 11th, but now, not in California on February 28th, but now, and any other states that are retaining the altered legal forms that were put in place through the emergency. And along with that, we need to end all remaining mandates that exist. We took a major step in that direction yesterday in this House by passing legislation to end President Biden's vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. We also need to look at reforming our emergency laws to make it so you cannot so easily declare an emergency that lasts for years and is allowed to continue indefinitely without any serious review of whether the conditions of emergency continue to exist. In a broader sense, I think that this is a moment where we as a country need to look at the consolidation and centralization of political power in this country. Yes, at the state level, but largely at the federal level, and especially in bureaucracies that operate outside any sort of accountability on the part of voters. We simply have seen this happen over the course of decades in this country, and it's veered us farther and farther from the idea of self-government that was the great American institution, innovation, the institution of self-government. Now, I am seeing encouraging signs in many ways that this is beginning to happen. For example, I'm starting to see at the school board level, parents are getting involved like never before. Parents are running for school board and changing the way that local school districts operate and trying to fight against mandates from the state level that tell them how they should run their schools. The beauty of this is that it gives parents a direct access point in terms of how their local schools are run. That's the idea of self-government, and I think that's something to build on going forward. And finally, on the note of education, I do think we need to get much more serious in this country about civic education, which used to be something that was not simply some addendum to one of your classes, but was part and parcel of your entire education, what it was about, to prepare you for active citizenship, to be well-grounded in what has made America such a unique country in our nation's history, the greatest country in the world's history. What the Constitution is about, why we have institutions like freedom of speech, why the separation of powers and checks and balances are important. I think if we start to teach these things more meaningfully in our schools, then it will reinforce our civic institutions. It will leave them less vulnerable to the sort of transformation that they were put through over the course of the last few years. And should we ever face another pandemic or whatever other threat that may come our way, I think we'll be much better prepared to get through it in the way that Florida did, in the way that Placer County did, and not, unfortunately, in the way that California and many other parts of this country had to suffer through with such a high cost to so many people. Thank you, and I yield.